I spent 30 years sacrificing everything for my family. But what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and what it truly means to be taken for granted. My name is Margaret Johnson, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who value you the least. It was a Tuesday morning when I watched my son David's SUV disappear down our long gravel driveway, taking with it not just 3 passengers, but 30 years of my life's work. As the dust settled behind their tires, I stood there in my work boots and faded jeans, my weathered hands still dirty from the morning chores, wondering how I had become so invisible in my own family. You see, this farm wasn't just where we lived. It was built with my blood, sweat, and every ounce of strength I had. When David was just 2 years old and his father walked out on us, leaving nothing but debt and broken promises, I made a decision that would shape the next 3 decades of my life. I would give my son everything I never had, no matter what it cost me. Back then, this land was nothing but rocky soil and wild grass. I remember carrying David on my back in an old baby carrier while I cleared rocks from what would eventually become our vegetable garden. His tiny hands would grab at my hair as I bent over, pulling weeds that seemed to grow faster than I could remove them. When he napped in the afternoons, I'd work on the chicken coop, hammering boards together with hands that were already developing the calluses that would become permanent reminders of my dedication. The early years were the hardest. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning to milk our 3 cows before David stirred in his crib. By the time he was ready for breakfast, I'd already fed the chickens, collected eggs, and started a load of laundry in the old washing machine that leaked water across the kitchen floor. David would sit in his high chair, babbling happily, while I scrambled eggs with one hand and stirred oatmeal with the other, my eyes heavy from another night of too little sleep. As David grew, so did our farm. Every extra dollar went back into improvements, expansion, or his future. When he was 8 and wanted to play Little League like the other kids in town, I sold my grandmother's pearl necklace to pay for his equipment and registration fees. When he was 12 and needed a better computer for school, I worked double shifts at the local diner to afford it, coming home each night with aching feet and the smell of grease in my hair. But it was when David turned 16 that I made the biggest sacrifice of all. He had dreams of going to college, studying business like his friends from wealthier families. The guidance counselor had pulled me aside after a parent-teacher conference, her voice gentle but direct. "Mrs. Johnson," she had said, "David has real potential, but college is expensive, and I know finances are tight on the farm." That night, I sat at our old kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, running numbers until my eyes burned. The farm was worth something now after all those years of improvements. The back 40 acres, the ones I had planned to use for expanding our crop rotation, could be sold. It would be enough for David's tuition, room, and board, and maybe even a little left over for books. I never told David about selling that land. I simply told him his college fund was ready and watched his face light up with the kind of joy that made every sacrifice worthwhile. The papers were signed quietly, the land sold to a neighboring farmer who promised to take good care of it. David left for college that fall with everything he needed, and I stayed behind with a smaller farm but a heart full of pride. College changed David. When he came home for visits, he'd talk about his business classes, his internships, his plans for the future. But somewhere in those 4 years, he also started looking at our farm differently. What had once been his playground, the place where he'd learned to drive the tractor and help me birth calves, now seemed small to him, provincial even. "Mom," he'd say, looking around our kitchen with its mismatched chairs and the refrigerator that hummed too loudly, "don't you ever want something more than this?" I'd smile and tell him that this farm was everything I wanted, but the truth was more complicated. This farm was my life's work, the tangible proof of everything I had accomplished. Every weathered fence post, every flourishing tomato plant, every chicken that laid eggs in the coop I had built with my own hands, it was all me. It was my legacy. After graduation, David moved to the city for his first job. He'd call every Sunday, dutifully updating me on his life, but I could hear the distance in his voice. Not just the physical miles between us, but something deeper. The farm, and by extension me, had become something he had moved beyond. Then he met Ashley. Ashley was everything I wasn't. Where I was practical, she was fashionable. Where I was direct, she was diplomatic. Where I had calloused hands and permanent dirt under my fingernails, she had manicured nails and soft skin that had never known manual labor. She was beautiful, educated, and came from the kind of family that took vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. When David brought her home for the first time, I tried so hard to make a good impression. I cooked for 3 days straight, preparing all of David's favorite meals. I even bought a new tablecloth for our old dining room table and picked flowers from my garden for a centerpiece. But I could see in Ashley's eyes that our home, my home, fell short of whatever she had imagined. "It's so rustic," she had said, her voice carefully neutral. "David's told me so much about growing up here." The way she said rustic made it sound like a limitation rather than a choice. Their wedding was held at a country club in the city, a place where the flowers and the centerpieces cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for David's college graduation, and tried to blend in with Ashley's family and friends. But I felt out of place among the lawyers and doctors and business executives, like a weed in a garden of roses. David looked so handsome in his tuxedo and so happy as he danced with Ashley under twinkling lights. I sat at my assigned table, making polite conversation with Ashley's elderly aunt, and told myself that this was what I had worked for. This was David's happiness, and that was worth everything. After the wedding, David and Ashley moved into a nice apartment in the city. They'd visit the farm occasionally, usually for major holidays, but those visits felt different now. Ashley would wear expensive jeans and designer boots that she'd clearly bought just for the occasion, trying to look the part of a farm visitor. She'd comment on how peaceful it was here, how charming our simple way of life seemed. But I wasn't blind. I could see her checking her phone constantly, counting the hours until they could return to their real life. I could see David explaining things to her about the farm like a tour guide, not like someone who had once called this place home. Everything changed when Ashley's mother, Linda, came to live with them. Linda was a force of nature, the kind of woman who had opinions about everything and never hesitated to share them. She was recently divorced from Ashley's father, and rather than finding her own place, she had moved in with the newlyweds temporarily to help with household expenses. That temporary arrangement was now going on its second year. Linda had very clear ideas about how families should work, and most of those ideas seemed to revolve around the concept that I was doing everything wrong. During their visits to the farm, she'd make comments that felt like gentle suggestions, but cut like paper cuts. "Margaret, dear," she'd say, watching me prepare dinner, "have you ever considered that David might prefer lighter, healthier meals? Ashley's been teaching him about nutrition." Or, "It's sweet how attached you are to this old place, but don't you think David and Ashley need space to build their own traditions?" The worst part was that David never defended me. He'd just smile uncomfortably and change the subject, as if Linda's comments were reasonable observations rather than calculated criticisms. Last month, everything came to a head during what I thought would be a nice family dinner. I had spent the entire day preparing David's favorite meal: pot roast with vegetables from my garden, homemade bread, and the apple pie recipe that had been in our family for 3 generations. I set the table with my good china, the set I'd inherited from my mother, and lit candles to make the evening special. But the dinner was a disaster from the moment they walked in. Linda took one look at the dining room and sighed dramatically. "Oh, Margaret," she said, "this is lovely. But don't you think it's time to update your decorating? Ashley's been showing me some wonderful ideas from those home improvement shows." During dinner, she critiqued everything from the seasoning on the roast to the thread count of my napkins. But the final blow came when she started talking about David's future. "You know," Linda said, cutting her meat with precise, disapproving movements, "David has so much potential, but I worry that being tied to this place is holding him back. Successful people in business need to be mobile, flexible. They can't be weighed down by obligations to outdated ways of life." The way she said outdated ways of life while looking directly at me made her meaning crystal clear. I was the obligation. I was the weight holding David back. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't contradict her. Ashley nodded along, adding, "Mom makes a good point. There are so many opportunities in the city that David could explore if he didn't have to worry about maintaining connections to the past." I felt something break inside my chest, a crack that started small but spread quickly through everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my son. These two women who had never worked a day on this farm, who had never sacrificed anything for David's happiness, were sitting at my table, eating food I had grown and prepared with my own hands, and discussing me like I was a problem to be solved. After dinner, David walked me to the kitchen while Ashley and Linda continued their conversation in the dining room. "Mom," he said quietly, "you know they don't mean anything by it. She's very opinionated." "She's not just opinionated, David," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "She's trying to convince you that your own mother is a burden." David looked uncomfortable, running his hand through his hair the way he used to when he was a little boy caught in a lie. "It's not like that," he said. "It's just, maybe it would be good for you to consider that there might be other ways to live. You've done so much for me, and I'm grateful. But maybe it's time for you to think about what you want for yourself." What I wanted for myself, as if the past 30 years of my life had been some kind of temporary arrangement, something I could just set aside now that David was grown and married. That conversation happened 3 weeks ago, and yesterday morning David made an announcement that proved Linda's influence had won. "Mom," he said, his voice bright with forced enthusiasm, "Ashley and I are planning a little getaway to the coast. Linda's coming with us. She's never seen the Pacific, and we thought it would be nice to show her around." I waited for him to mention me, to ask if I'd like to come along, but the invitation never came. "That sounds wonderful," I managed to say. "When are you leaving?" "This morning, actually. We're driving up the coast, maybe staying in some bed and breakfasts, visiting some wineries. It'll be a nice break from the city." "And what about the farm?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. David's smile faltered slightly. "Well, we were hoping you could handle things here for a few days. You know how much you love working in the garden, and it's not like anything urgent is happening right now." Not like anything urgent was happening, as if the daily care of livestock, the maintenance of equipment, the constant vigilance required to keep a farm running was just a hobby, something I did to keep myself busy. "How long will you be gone?" I asked. "Just a week," Ashley chimed in, appearing in the kitchen doorway. "Maybe 10 days at most. We really need this time together as a family." As a family. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I was David's mother, the woman who had raised him single-handedly, who had sacrificed my own dreams to make his possible. But somehow I was not part of his family anymore. I stood in the kitchen, watching my son load suitcases into his SUV, while Ashley checked items off a detailed packing list and Linda supervised from the passenger seat. None of them asked if I needed anything while they were gone. None of them seemed to consider that managing a farm alone for 10 days might be challenging for a woman my age. None of them appeared to notice that they were leaving me behind like an afterthought. "Take care of yourself, Mom," David said, giving me a quick hug that felt more like an obligation than affection. "We'll call you when we get there." And then they were gone. I watched their SUV disappear down the driveway, taking with it my son, my hopes for our relationship, and any illusions I still harbored about my place in David's life. The dust from their tires settled slowly, and the farm fell silent except for the distant lowing of cattle. and the whisper of wind through the corn. For the first time in 30 years, I was completely alone on the land I had built with my own hands. But instead of feeling abandoned, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, a strange, unsettling sense of possibility. The first day without them was harder than I expected, but not for the reasons I anticipated. The physical work wasn't the problem. I'd been managing most of the farm tasks on my own for years anyway. David's help during his visits had become largely symbolic, more about his need to feel connected to his roots than any real contribution to the daily operations. No, the difficulty was emotional. Every routine reminded me of my solitude. When I prepared breakfast, I automatically reached for 3 plates before remembering I only needed 1. When I collected eggs from the chicken coop, I found myself composing mental stories to share with David later, only to realize there would be no phone calls, no interested questions about the farm's daily dramas. But something else was happening too, something I wasn't quite ready to acknowledge yet. Without the constant undercurrent of tension that had become normal during David's visits, without Linda's pointed observations and Ashley's polite but distant presence, the farm felt different. It felt like mine again. On the second day, I discovered something that would change everything. I was in David's old room, which had become a combination guest room and storage space over the years. Ashley always insisted on staying there during visits, though she'd made it clear that the room's rustic charm was more quaint than comfortable. I was changing the sheets and tidying up when I noticed that Ashley had left some papers on the nightstand. Normally, I would never look at someone else's private documents, but one of the papers had caught my eye because it had our farm's address printed at the top. It was a real estate evaluation. My hands shook as I picked up the document and read it carefully. It was a detailed appraisal of our property, commissioned just 2 weeks ago. According to the evaluation, our farm was worth significantly more than I had realized. The land values in our area had increased dramatically over the past few years, driven by urban sprawl and the growing trend of city dwellers seeking rural retreats. But what truly stunned me was the date on a second document underneath the appraisal. It was a preliminary inquiry about development potential, exploring the possibility of subdividing our land for residential construction. The inquiry had been initiated by David. David was planning to sell the farm. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the papers scattered across my lap, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just about them wanting me to visit less often or be less involved in their lives. This was about erasing my life's work entirely, turning the farm I had built from nothing into a suburban development. The third document in the stack was the most devastating of all. It was a draft of a legal document, something about power of attorney and managing assets for aging parents. The language was complex, full of legal terminology I didn't fully understand, but the basic intention was clear. They were laying the groundwork to take control of my finances and property. I thought about all of Linda's comments about my outdated way of life. I thought about Ashley's suggestions that I might be happier in a retirement community. I thought about David's recent conversations about my future, his gentle hints that I should consider downsizing. They weren't just trying to distance themselves from me. They were planning to eliminate me. That evening, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee, looking out over the land I had poured my life into. The vegetable garden was flourishing in the late summer heat, the tomatoes heavy on their vines, the corn standing tall and green in neat rows. The chickens were settling into their coop for the night, and I could hear the cattle moving slowly through the pasture, their bells creating a gentle soundtrack to the approaching dusk. This farm represented 30 years of backbreaking work, of sacrifices that no one would ever fully understand. I had built it not just as a business or a home, but as a legacy for David. And now he wanted to tear it down and sell it off piece by piece to the highest bidder. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, something shifted inside me. The grief I had been carrying since yesterday morning began to transform into something harder, cleaner, something that felt uncomfortably like anger. I thought about all the times I had put David's needs ahead of my own, All the times I had smiled and nodded when Linda criticized my choices. All the times I had made myself smaller, quieter, less demanding, hoping that if I just didn't ask for too much, I wouldn't be seen as a burden. And what had it gotten me? A son who saw me as an obstacle to his happiness, a daughter-in-law who viewed me as an embarrassment to be managed, a future mother-in-law who treated me like a servant in my own home. Tomorrow, I decided, things were going to change. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I had spent the night thinking, planning, and by the time the sun rose over the eastern pasture, I knew exactly what I needed to do. First, I needed to understand my legal and financial position. I drove into town to visit Harold Morrison, the lawyer who had handled my affairs for the past 15 years. Harold was an old-fashioned country lawyer, the kind of man who still wore suspenders and kept hard candy in a dish on his desk for children who accompanied their parents to appointments. "Margaret," he said, looking up from the real estate documents I had brought with me, "I have to ask, did you authorize your son to commission this appraisal?" "I did not," I replied firmly, "and I certainly didn't authorize him to explore development options for my land." Harold removed his reading glasses and looked at me seriously. "Well, the good news is that David has no legal authority to sell your property or make decisions about your finances without your explicit consent. The farm is in your name. The bank accounts are in your name, and you're clearly competent to manage your own affairs." He paused, studying the draft power of attorney document. "However," he continued, "it appears that your son and his wife are laying the groundwork to challenge that competency. This document suggests they're preparing to argue that you're no longer capable of managing your financial affairs independently." The reality of what David was planning hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't enough for him to distance himself from me emotionally. He was actually trying to take control of my life entirely. "What are my options?" I asked. Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Well, the most important thing is to make sure your wishes are clearly documented and legally protected. We should update your will, establish clear directives about your healthcare decisions, and most importantly, make sure that all your financial accounts and property ownership documents are absolutely unambiguous." We spent the next 2 hours going through every aspect of my financial life. Harold helped me understand exactly what I owned, what I controlled, and how to protect myself from any future attempts to claim I was incompetent or needed outside management. What I discovered surprised me. Over the years, my careful management and frugal lifestyle had resulted in significantly more financial security than I had realized. The farm was worth more than the appraisal had suggested. My savings accounts had grown steadily, and I had investments that David didn't even know about. But the most important discovery was about the joint accounts. When David had gotten married, I had added his name to several of my bank accounts, thinking it would make things easier if anything ever happened to me. It was a gesture of trust and inclusion, a way of making him feel like a full partner in the family finances. What I hadn't considered was that joint accounts gave David equal access to my money. Every checking account, every savings account, every investment account that had his name on it was legally accessible to him, regardless of who had actually deposited the money. "Margaret," Harold said gently, "David could, if he chose to, withdraw every penny from these joint accounts. Legally, he has as much right to that money as you do." The implications were staggering. David and Ashley could theoretically clean out my accounts while they were on vacation, leaving me with nothing. They could use my own money to fund their plans to sell my farm and force me into a retirement home. "What can I do about it?" I asked. Harold smiled for the first time that morning. "Well, that's the beauty of joint accounts," he said. "They work both ways. You have just as much right to move or freeze that money as he does." I drove home from Harold's office with a new understanding of my situation. I wasn't a helpless victim waiting for my son to make decisions about my future. I was a property owner, a businesswoman, and someone with considerably more financial power than anyone realized. That afternoon, I took a long walk through my farm, really seeing it for the first time in months. I had been so focused on the emotional dynamics, so worried about David's disapproval and Ashley's criticism, that I had stopped noticing the beauty and value of what I had created. The fence lines were straight and strong, repaired and maintained through years of careful attention. The pastures were lush and well managed, supporting healthy livestock that provided both income and food security. The vegetable garden was a masterpiece of sustainable agriculture, producing more food than I could eat and enough surplus to sell at the local farmers market. This wasn't just a quaint rural lifestyle. This was a successful, profitable, sustainable business that I had built and operated single-handedly for 3 decades. The fact that David saw it as an embarrassment said more about his values than mine. As I walked, I thought about the past few days, about the loneliness and abandonment I had felt. But I also thought about the peace I had experienced without the constant undercurrent of judgment and criticism. I thought about how much easier it had been to make decisions without worrying about whether they would meet with Ashley's approval or Linda's commentary. Maybe being alone wasn't the worst thing that could happen to me. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. That evening, my phone rang just as I was settling into my favorite chair on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. For a moment, I considered not answering. The caller ID showed David's name, and I wasn't sure I was ready to pretend everything was normal between us. But old habits die hard, and I found myself reaching for the phone. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "How's your trip going?" "Oh, Mom, it's incredible!" David's voice was bright with excitement. "The coast is absolutely beautiful. Ashley's mom is having such a wonderful time. She says she's never seen anything like it. We're staying at this amazing bed and breakfast right on the beach, and tomorrow we're going wine tasting." I listened to him describe their activities, their meals, their plans for the next day. He sounded happier and more relaxed than I had heard him in months. It struck me that this was exactly the tone I remembered from his childhood, when he would call me from summer camp or school trips, bubbling over with enthusiasm about his adventures. The difference was that back then, his excitement had always included anticipation about coming home to share everything with me. Now, there was no mention of missing me, no questions about how I was managing the farm alone, no indication that my presence had even crossed his mind. "That sounds wonderful, David," I said when he finished his description of their sunset dinner overlooking the ocean. "I'm so glad you're all having such a good time." "Thanks, Mom. You're the best for handling everything there. We really needed this break. Not I needed this break or Ashley needed this break, but we. I was not part of the we that needed rest and rejuvenation. I was the person who made their rest possible by handling the responsibilities they left behind. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of my farm settling into evening. The automatic sprinklers had kicked on in the vegetable garden, creating a gentle rhythm against the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the old barn cat meowing, probably announcing a successful hunt to anyone who cared to listen. For 30 years, these sounds had been the backdrop to my contentment. This farm, this life had been enough for me, more than enough. It had been everything. But somewhere along the way, I had started seeing it through other people's eyes. Through David's embarrassment, Ashley's polite tolerance, Linda's barely concealed disdain. When had I stopped trusting my own judgment about what constituted a good life? I thought about the conversation with Harold earlier that day, about the financial power I possessed but had never fully recognized. I thought about the real estate documents hidden in David's room, about the careful planning that was being done without my knowledge or consent. But mostly, I thought about a conversation I had overheard the last time David and Ashley visited. I had been in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard them talking on the back porch. The windows were open and their voices carried clearly through the evening air. "I just don't understand why she's so attached to this place," Ashley had said. "It's not like she couldn't be comfortable somewhere else. somewhere more appropriate for someone her age. She's worked her whole life to build this farm, David had replied, but his voice lacked conviction. It's not easy to just walk away from something like that. But that's exactly the problem, Linda's voice had cut in. She's worked her whole life, and what does she have to show for it? A run-down farm in the middle of nowhere, no social life, no culture, no stimulation. It's not healthy for someone to be so isolated. The farm isn't run down, David had protested weakly. Oh, honey, Ashley's voice was gentle but firm. You know what I mean. It's quaint, and I'm sure it was perfect when you were growing up. But your mother deserves better than to spend her golden years alone out here, struggling to maintain a property that's too much for one person to handle. What are you suggesting? David had asked. I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to have a serious conversation about her future, Linda had said. There are wonderful retirement communities these days, places where she could have friends her own age, activities, healthcare nearby. She could sell this place, invest the money properly, and live comfortably for the rest of her life without having to worry about livestock and crops and all the stress that comes with farming. But she loves farming, David had said, though again his voice carried no real conviction. She thinks she loves farming, Ashley had corrected. But that's only because she's never experienced anything else. Once she adjusts to a different lifestyle, she'll probably wonder why she waited so long to make the change. I had stood frozen in my kitchen, dish towel in hand, listening to 3 people plan my future as if I were a child who couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions. They spoke about me with the kind of fond condescension usually reserved for elderly relatives who had begun to lose their mental faculties. But the most painful part wasn't their presumption. It was David's lack of resistance to their plans. This was the son I had sacrificed everything for, the child I had raised to be independent and strong, and he was allowing his wife and mother-in-law to convince him that his own mother was incapable of managing her own life. Now, sitting on my porch in the darkness, I realized that conversation had been the beginning of my awakening. That was when I had started to understand that I wasn't just being excluded from David's new life. I was being actively undermined. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of confusion and hurt that had clouded my thinking for months had lifted, replaced by a cold, sharp understanding of my situation. I wasn't a burden to be managed. I wasn't an aging parent who needed to be gently guided toward more appropriate living arrangements. I was a competent businesswoman who owned valuable property and had significant financial resources. I was someone with the power to make my own decisions about my own future. And I was someone who had been far too generous for far too long with people who had mistaken my kindness for weakness. I made coffee and sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and pen. For the next hour, I made lists, assets I controlled, accounts that bore David's name, decisions I needed to make, steps I needed to take. By the time I finished, I had a plan. First, I called Harold Morrison. Harold, it's Margaret Johnson. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'd like to make some changes to my financial arrangements. What kind of changes? Harold asked. I want to remove David's name from all my accounts, every single one. I want to establish new accounts that are solely in my name, and I want to transfer all my assets to those new accounts. There was a brief pause. Margaret, that's certainly within your rights to do, but it's a significant step. Are you sure this is what you want? I'm absolutely sure, I replied, and I want to do it today. Harold's voice was carefully neutral. May I ask what's prompted this decision? I told him about the documents I had found, about the overheard conversation, about the gradual realization that David and Ashley were planning to take control of my finances, whether I agreed or not. I see, Harold said when I finished. Well, in that case, I think you're making a very wise decision. Can you come in this morning? We can have everything set up and transferred by this afternoon. I'll be there in an hour, I said. The drive to town gave me time to think about what I was about to do. This wasn't just about protecting my money, it was about reclaiming my autonomy. For too long, I had allowed other people to define my worth, my capabilities, my future. I had been so focused on maintaining relationships that I had forgotten the most important relationship of all, the one I had with myself. At Harold's office, we worked methodically through every account, every investment, every financial instrument that had David's name attached to it. Harold explained each step carefully, making sure I understood the implications of what I was doing. Once we complete these transfers, he said, David will no longer have any access to your funds. Are you prepared for the conversation you'll need to have with him about this? I'm prepared, I said, though the truth was I had no idea how I would explain my actions to David. I only knew that I needed to take them. There's one more thing, Harold said as we finished the paperwork. Given what you've told me about your son's plans, I think it would be wise to establish a revocable trust. This would ensure that even if someone tried to challenge your competency in the future, your assets would be protected and distributed according to your wishes. We spent another hour setting up the trust, with Harold serving as trustee and detailed instructions about how my assets should be managed if I ever became unable to do so myself. By the time we finished, I had created a fortress around my financial independence that no one could breach without my explicit consent. But the most important change was psychological. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. I felt powerful, capable, in control of my own destiny. That afternoon, I drove home and walked through my farm with new eyes. This wasn't just the place where I lived, it was my kingdom, built with my own hands and sustained by my own labor. The vegetable garden that Linda had dismissed as quaint was actually a sophisticated operation that produced thousands of dollars worth of organic produce each year. The livestock that Ashley found rustic were valuable assets that provided both income and food security. I had allowed other people's opinions to diminish my sense of what I had accomplished, but the truth was undeniable. I had built something remarkable here, something that most people could never achieve. As I stood in my kitchen that evening preparing dinner for one, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride. Not the vicarious pride I felt in David's accomplishments, but actual pride in my own achievements. I had raised a son single-handedly while building a successful farm. I had put that son through college without taking on debt. I had created a sustainable, profitable business that supported not just me, but contributed to the local economy through the food I sold and the workers I occasionally hired during busy seasons. I had done all of this while maintaining the property, caring for animals, and managing complex financial responsibilities. I had done it without a partner, without a trust fund, without any of the advantages that many people took for granted. And somehow, I had allowed myself to believe that these accomplishments made me a burden rather than a success. The phone rang around 8 o'clock. It was David again, calling from what sounded like a restaurant, with Ashley and Linda's voices chattering in the background. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice slightly slurred with wine. "Just wanted to check in. We had the most amazing day. Went to 3 different wineries, and Ashley's mom bought a case of this incredible Pinot Noir to ship home." "That sounds lovely," I said, genuinely meaning it. There was no reason David shouldn't enjoy his vacation. My problem wasn't with his happiness. It was with the assumption that his happiness required my diminishment. "How are things there?" he asked, almost as an afterthought. "Everything's fine," I replied. "The farm is running smoothly." "Great, great. Oh, and Mom? We've decided to extend the trip a few more days, maybe even a week. Linda is having such a wonderful time, and we found this great deal on a beach house rental. You don't mind, do you?" A week ago, I would have minded. I would have felt hurt and abandoned, left to manage everything while they enjoyed themselves without a thought for my welfare. But tonight, the idea of having more time alone with my thoughts and my plans felt like a gift. "I don't mind at all," I said. Take all the time you need. You're the best, Mom. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart." After we hung up, I sat in my living room and tried to remember the last time David had told me he loved me without it feeling like an obligation or an afterthought. I couldn't recall a specific instance, which told me everything I needed to know about how our relationship had evolved. The next 3 days passed peacefully. I fell into a rhythm that felt natural and sustainable. Early mornings tending to the animals, afternoons working in the garden, evenings on the porch with a book and a glass of iced tea. I spoke to neighbors I hadn't had time to visit properly in months. I caught up on farm maintenance projects that had been languishing. Most importantly, I thought about my future. Not the future that other people were planning for me, but the future I wanted for myself. I realized that I had never really considered my own desires separate from David's needs. For 30 years, my identity had been built around being his mother, and everything else had been secondary. But David was a grown man now, with his own life and his own family. It was time for me to figure out who Margaret Johnson was when she wasn't primarily defined by her relationship to someone else. The answer surprised me. Without the constant worry about David's approval, without the pressure to justify my choices to people who had already decided I was wrong, I discovered that I actually loved my life. I loved the physical work of farming, the connection to the land, the satisfaction of producing food with my own hands. I loved the independence, the self-sufficiency, the knowledge that I could take care of myself without depending on anyone else. I didn't need rescuing from my circumstances. My circumstances were exactly what I had chosen, and they suited me perfectly. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after David and his family had left for their vacation, I was working in the vegetable garden when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it since I was in the middle of harvesting tomatoes and my hands were dirty. But something about the insistent ringing made me wipe my hands on my jeans and check the caller ID. It was David, calling from the coast. "Mom!" His voice was sharp with panic, completely different from the relaxed, wine-mellowed tone of his previous calls. "Mom, something's wrong. We're trying to pay for breakfast and our card got declined. Then Ashley tried her card, and that got declined too. We went to an ATM and it says we have insufficient funds, but that's impossible. We just checked our balance a few days ago." I stood very still in my garden, surrounded by the tomato plants I had nurtured from seeds, listening to my son's confusion and growing panic. "What account are you trying to access?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The joint account, the one you set up for emergencies and family expenses. Mom, there should be plenty of money in there, more than enough to cover this trip, but the ATM is saying the balance is zero." I took a deep breath, tasting the morning air that carried the scent of rich soil and growing things. In the background of David's call, I could hear Ashley's voice, high and worried, asking what was wrong. I could hear Linda making suggestions about calling the bank, about checking for fraud. "David," I said calmly, "I closed that account." There was complete silence on the other end of the line. Even the background chatter from Ashley and Linda had stopped. "You..." "What?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "I closed the joint accounts," I repeated. "All of them. The money is now in accounts that are solely in my name." But why? "Mom, what's going on? Did someone force you to do this? Are you being scammed?" I almost laughed at the irony. David's first assumption was that I couldn't possibly have made this decision on my own, that I must have been manipulated or deceived. Even now, even when confronted with evidence of my independent action, he couldn't conceive of me as someone capable of making strategic financial decisions. "No one forced me to do anything," I said. "I made this decision myself after discovering some very interesting documents in your room." Another long silence. "What documents?" David asked, but his voice had changed. The panic was still there, but it was now mixed with something that sounded like guilt. "The real estate appraisal, David. The development inquiry, the draft power of attorney papers. I found them all." I heard Ashley's voice in the background, sharp and worried. "What is she talking about? What papers?" "Mom," David said, his voice pleading now. "You don't understand. We were just exploring options. We were trying to plan for your future, to make sure you're taken care of." "No, David," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "You were planning my future without consulting me. You were treating me like an incompetent child who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. And you were using my own money to fund your planning. That's not... We weren't..." David struggled to find words. "Mom, we love you. We want what's best for you." "What's best for me," I said, "is being treated with the respect due to a competent adult who has successfully managed her own affairs for 70 years. What's best for me is being consulted about decisions that affect my life. What's best for me is not being discussed like a problem to be solved when you think I'm not listening." I could hear Ashley and Linda talking urgently in the background, but I couldn't make out their words. David was silent, and I wondered if he was remembering the conversation on the back porch, wondering how much I had overheard. "David," I continued, "for 30 years, I have put your needs ahead of my own. I have made every sacrifice, every compromise, every adjustment to ensure your happiness and success. I sold my own land to pay for your education. I worked myself to exhaustion to build something I could leave to you. I welcomed your wife into our family even when she made it clear that nothing about our life met her standards. I tolerated months of criticism and condescension from your mother-in-law because I thought maintaining family harmony was more important than defending myself." My voice was getting stronger as I spoke, fed by years of suppressed frustration and hurt. But when I discovered that my generosity was being interpreted as weakness, when I learned that my sacrifices were being seen as evidence of my incompetence, when I realized that you were planning to take control of my life, whether I agreed or not, that's when I decided things needed to change. "Mom, please." David's voice was desperate now. "We can talk about this when we get home. We can work this out. But right now, we're stuck here with no money, and we don't know what to do." I looked around my garden, at the neat rows of vegetables I had planted and tended, at the farm I had built from nothing through decades of hard work and careful planning. I thought about David and Ashley and Linda sitting in some expensive coastal restaurant, finally understanding that their plans for my future had been built on the assumption that I would never stand up for myself. "David," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "for 30 years, I've been there to solve your problems and bail you out of difficult situations. I've been the safety net that let you take risks, the backup plan that meant you never had to worry about the consequences of your decisions." I paused, watching a butterfly land on my tomato plants, its wings bright against the green leaves. "But you're not a child anymore. You're a successful businessman with a wife and a career. It's time for you to solve your own problems." "But Mom, you have credit cards, David. You have friends you could call. Ashley has family. Linda has resources. Figure it out. The same way I've been figuring things out on my own for most of my adult life." "Are you saying you won't help us?" David's voice carried a note of disbelief, as if the possibility had never occurred to him. "I'm saying that help is something you ask for, not something you take for granted. I'm saying that if you want my assistance, you need to treat me like a partner, not a problem. I'm saying that my money is mine to control, and my future is mine to decide." There was a long pause, filled with urgent whispering in the background. "Mom," David said finally, "when we get back, we need to have a serious conversation about what's going on with you. This isn't like you. This isn't normal behavior." And there it was, the inevitable suggestion that my newfound independence was evidence of declining mental capacity rather than healthy assertiveness. I had expected this response, but it still stung to hear my own son pathologize my refusal to be taken advantage of. "You're absolutely right, David," I said. "This isn't like me. For 30 years, I've been so focused on taking care of everyone else that I forgot to take care of myself. I've been so worried about maintaining relationships that I accepted being disrespected and dismissed. I've been so afraid of being seen as demanding that I became invisible. I walked over to my favorite tomato plant, heavy with fruit that would be perfect for canning. But that version of me wasn't healthy, David. That version of me was afraid and codependent and unable to set appropriate boundaries. This version of me, the one who knows her own worth and insists on being treated accordingly, this is actually the healthiest I've been in years. Mom, I'm going to go now, I said. I have work to do here, and you have problems to solve there. When you're ready to have a conversation based on mutual respect, when you're ready to acknowledge that I'm capable of making my own decisions about my own life, then we can talk. But until then, I suggest you focus on figuring out how to get home without my assistance. Mom, wait! But I had already hung up. I stood in my garden for a long moment holding my silent phone, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades, complete autonomy. For the first time in 30 years, I had put my own needs first. I had refused to rescue someone else from the consequences of their assumptions and poor planning. I had chosen my own well-being over someone else's convenience. It felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The phone began ringing again almost immediately. David's name appeared on the caller ID, then disappeared as the call went to voicemail. It rang again and again. I turned off the ringer and slipped the phone into my pocket. I had vegetables to harvest, and for the first time in my adult life, that felt like exactly where I wanted to be.